Last Christmas, I set up a camera at our family dinner table, and what started as a simple idea became the most important thing I've ever done. I captured voices and stories that would have been lost forever, and it changed everything. My name is Catherine Wells, and I am 70 years old. And last Christmas, I did something I had been thinking about for years, but had never found the courage to actually do. I decided to record my family stories, all of them, the funny ones and the sad ones and the ones we had told so many times they had become legend, and I wanted to capture them on video so that when I was gone, my grandchildren and great grandchildren would still be able to hear these voices and see these faces and understand where they came from. The idea came to me on Christmas Eve when I was setting the table for our holiday dinner, carefully placing the good china that had belonged to my mother and arranging the silverware that my grandmother had brought with her when she immigrated as a young bride. I was running my fingers over the worn handles of those old forks and knives, feeling the weight of all the hands that had held them before mine, and I suddenly felt this overwhelming urgency to preserve something before it was too late. My husband had died 3 years earlier, and several of my siblings were gone, and the older generation was disappearing one by one, taking their memories with them into silence. I had watched it happen with my own parents, how we waited too long to ask them the important questions, how we assumed there would always be more time, and then suddenly they were gone and all those stories went with them. I remembered sitting at my father's funeral and realizing I didn't know basic things about his life, like what his childhood was like, or how he met my mother, or what dreams he had when he was young. And that ignorance felt like a failure, like I had been so busy living my own life that I forgot to learn about the life that made mine possible. So as I set that Christmas table, I made a decision that felt both simple and profound. I would use this gathering to start collecting our family stories before they disappeared. Forever. I had invited everyone for dinner the next day, my 3 children and their spouses, my 7 grandchildren ranging in age from 8 to 24, and my younger sister, Margaret, who was the only sibling I had left. I knew that getting this multi-generational group together and actually engaged in meaningful conversation would be challenging because the teenagers would want to be on their phones and the adults would be tired, and everyone had their own dramas and distractions. But I also knew that if I didn't create this opportunity, it might never happen. And the thought of losing these stories terrified me in a way I couldn't quite explain. That night, I barely slept, lying awake and thinking about all the questions I wanted to ask and all the stories I wanted to make sure got told. I thought about my grandmother and the story of how she learned to speak English by listening to the radio and practicing with her children, and how she used to make this special bread on Sundays that filled the whole house with the most incredible smell. I thought about my father and how he had worked 3 jobs to put himself through college, coming home so exhausted he would fall asleep at the dinner table, but still insisting on reading to us before bed. I thought about my mother and the way she had held our family together during the hard years when money was tight and my father was drinking too much, how she had created magic out of nothing and made us feel rich even when we were poor. All of these memories were precious to me, but they existed only in my head and in the heads of a few other people who were getting older every day. And I realized that once we were gone, these stories would be gone too unless someone took the time to preserve them. On Christmas morning, I woke up early and went to the store to buy a small video camera and a tripod. Nothing fancy, but good enough to capture faces and voices clearly. The young man at the electronics store seemed puzzled when I told him what I wanted to do, asking if I wouldn't rather just use my phone. But I explained that I wanted something that felt more intentional, more ceremonial, something that would signal to my family that what we were doing mattered. He helped me pick out a simple setup and showed me how to use it, and I practiced in the parking lot, recording myself talking and then playing it back to make sure it worked. Seeing my own face on that screen was jarring, the lines around my eyes deeper than I remembered, my hair completely white now instead of the blonde it had been most of my life. But there was something about my expression that pleased me, a determination and clarity that I recognized as my truest self. When I got home, I set up the camera in the corner of the dining room where it would have a good view of the table, and I practiced adjusting the angle and the lighting, feeling both excited and slightly foolish because I had never done anything like this before, and I worried that my family would think I was being dramatic or morbid. But every time that doubt crept in, I would think about my father's funeral and that hollow feeling of all the questions I never asked. And I would remind myself that this wasn't about being dramatic. It was about love and legacy and making sure the people who came after us would know where they came from. By early afternoon, the house was filled with the smell of roasting turkey and fresh bread and the apple pie I had made from my mother's recipe, and I kept checking the camera to make sure it was ready, even though I wasn't entirely sure when or how I would bring up my plan. My daughter Jennifer arrived first with her husband and their two teenage boys, and she immediately noticed the camera and asked what it was for, her tone suspicious in that way adult children get when they think their parents are up to something strange. I told her I wanted to record some family stories during dinner, just casual conversation about the past, and she looked at me with concern and asked if I was feeling okay, if there was something I needed to tell them. I laughed and assured her I was fine, that I just didn't want to lose all the family history the way we had lost so much when my parents died, and she relaxed a little, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced this was a normal thing to do. My son Robert came next with his wife and their three children, including the 8-year-old twins who immediately started running through the house with an energy that made me both exhausted and delighted. And when Robert saw the camera, he asked if I was making a documentary, and I said something like that, just wanting to preserve some memories. My youngest daughter, Sarah, arrived last with her two college-age daughters, and she was the only one who seemed genuinely excited about the camera, saying she thought it was all wonderful idea and asking if she could help me with the technical aspects since she was better with technology than I was. I felt grateful for her enthusiasm because it made the whole project feel less odd, less like something a lonely old woman was doing, and more like something the family could participate in together. When everyone was finally gathered around the table and the food was served, and the initial chaos of passing dishes and settling children had calmed down, I stood up and tapped my glass gently to get everyone's attention. I told them that before we ate, I wanted to explain why I had set up the camera, and the room got quiet in that uncomfortable way where people aren't sure if something serious is about to happen. I took a breath and said that I had been thinking a lot about how quickly time passes and how much of our family history had already been lost, and that I wanted to start recording our stories so that future generations would be able to hear them. I said I wasn't sick or dying or having some kind of crisis. I just didn't want to wait until it was too late the way we had with my parents. And I hoped they would be willing to participate by sharing memories and answering questions on camera. There was a moment of silence, and then my sister Margaret started crying. Not sad tears, but the kind that come from being moved by something, and she said she wished we had done this years ago when our parents were still alive. That seemed to break the ice, and suddenly everyone was nodding and saying they thought it was a good idea. And my grandson Tyler, who was 16, asked if he would have to talk on camera, and I said only if he wanted to, but that I hoped he would at least listen because these stories belong to him too. We ate dinner first because I didn't want anyone to feel pressured or uncomfortable, and the conversation flowed naturally the way it always did at family gatherings, with multiple conversations happening at once and people interrupting each other, and laughter rising and falling like waves. I watched my family around that table and felt this profound love mixed with sadness, because I knew that someday this exact configuration of people would never exist again, that time was always moving forward and taking things with it. And that's why it was so important to capture what we could while we still had the chance. After we finished eating and cleared the dishes, I turned on the camera and asked if we could start with Margaret, since she was the oldest person in the room and had memories that went back farther than anyone else's. She seemed nervous at first, adjusting her hair and asking if she looked okay. And I told her she looked beautiful and that this wasn't about looking perfect, it was about being real and honest. I started with simple questions, asking her to tell us about our grandmother and what she remembered from when she was young, and Margaret's face softened as she began to speak. She talked about how our grandmother used to wake up before dawn every morning to bake bread, how the smell would fill the entire house and drift out into the street, and how neighbors would sometimes knock on the door hoping to buy a loaf because everyone knew her bread was the best. She said our grandmother had incredibly strong hands from years of kneading dough and working in the garden, and that she could carry 2 full buckets of water without spilling a drop. Margaret told us that our grandmother had left her family at 18 to come to a new country with a man she barely knew, our grandfather, and that she had been so homesick. Those first years that she would cry every night, but she never complained during the day, because she believed in moving forward, not looking back. I watched my grandchildren listening to this story, really listening, and I saw something shift in their faces as they began to understand that their great great grandmother had been a real person with fears and courage and a whole life that led to them. Margaret then told a story I had never heard before about how our grandmother had hidden money in her mattress for years, saving every penny she could without telling anyone, and how when our grandfather got sick and they needed money for medicine, she pulled out this stash and it was enough to cover everything. She said our grandfather had been shocked and a little hurt that she hadn't trusted him with the knowledge of the savings. But our grandmother had explained that she wasn't hiding it from him, she was protecting it for him, because she had learned in her old country that women needed to have something set aside for emergencies. This story sparked a conversation about the different ways men and women of that generation viewed money and security, and my daughter Jennifer said she finally understood why I had always insisted on having my own bank account even after I got married, that it was a pattern passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter. Then I asked Margaret about our father and what he was like as a young man before we were born, and her eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. She said he had been incredibly funny, always making jokes and doing impressions that would have everyone laughing until they cried, and that he had wanted to be an actor when he was young, but our grandfather had told him that wasn't a real job and he needed to do something practical. She said our father had been heartbroken about giving up that dream, but he never talked about it, just went to work every day at the factory and came home and played with his children and tried to make the best of the life he had. I felt tears gathering in my eyes because I had never known this about my father, had never known that he had dreams beyond the life we saw him living, and I realized how much of him I had missed by not asking the right question. Margaret continued talking about our childhood, about the tiny apartment we all shared, and how our parents slept on a pull-out couch in the living room so that we kids could have the bedroom, and how our mother would make these elaborate meals out of almost nothing, stretching a single chicken into 3 different dinners. She talked about the Christmas when we were so poor that our parents couldn't afford presents. But our mother had stayed up all night sewing dolls out of old fabric, and our father had carved wooden toys from scraps of wood he brought home from work, and how we had no idea we were poor because our parents made everything feel magical and special. My grandson Tyler, who had been quiet up until this point, suddenly asked what kinds of toys our father had made, and Margaret described a little wooden truck that he had painted red with whatever paint he could find, and how her younger brother, who would have been our uncle if he had lived past age 5, had carried that truck everywhere until the wheels fell off, and even then he wouldn't let go of it. This mention of the uncle we never knew created a moment of heavy silence because it was a loss that Margaret had carried her whole life, and I saw her face crumble slightly before she collected herself and said that losing her baby brother had changed their whole family, had made their mother more protective and their father more withdrawn, and that grief had lived in their house like an extra person taking up space. I asked Margaret if she could tell us more about that loss, because I knew it was important, even though it was painful, and she took a deep breath and said that her brother had been sick for only 3 days, some kind of infection that happened so fast there was nothing anyone could do, and that she remembered sitting on the front steps while the doctor was inside and knowing somehow that he wasn't coming back out. She said she was 8 years old at the time, and that she had prayed harder than she had ever prayed for anything, making all kinds of promises about being good and helping more, and never complaining. But he died anyway, and she spent years thinking it was somehow her fault for not praying hard enough or not being good enough. She said it wasn't until she was much older that she understood that some things just happen, and it's nobody's fault, but that understanding didn't make the loss any less heavy. My daughter Sarah reached across the table and took Margaret's hand, and I saw tears on several faces around the table because this story had never been told so fully before. We had always known we had an uncle who died young, but we never understood what that loss had meant to the family. Margaret wiped her eyes and said she was sorry for making everyone sad on Christmas, and my granddaughter Emma, who was 22, said no. We needed to hear this. We needed to. know the hard parts too, because that's what makes us who we are. Then I shifted the conversation and asked Margaret to tell us something funny, something that would help us remember the joy that also existed in that house. And she laughed and said there was the time our father tried to fix the roof and fell through it and landed on our mother's bed completely unhurt but covered in dust and insulation. And our mother had screamed and then laughed so hard she couldn't breathe. She said our father had just lay there on the bed, looking up at the hole he had made and said, "Well, I guess we need a new roof now." And somehow they had found the money to fix it, even though they had no money for anything, and that became a family joke for years, that our father's solution to any problem was to fall through it. The mood in the room lightened, and people started sharing their own funny memories, and I let the camera roll while my children talked about the ridiculous things they remembered from their childhood. Robert told a story about the time he and his sisters had tried to give the dog a haircut and had accidentally shaved half of it before I caught them, and how the dog had looked so lopsided and pathetic that even I couldn't stay mad, and we all just laughed at the poor creature until the hair grew back. Jennifer talked about the elaborate plays she used to force her siblings to perform with her, complete with costumes made from bedsheet and performances that would go on for hours, and how Sarah had always played the tree or the rock because she refused to memorize lines. Sarah defended herself by saying she was a very expressive tree and that her interpretive movements had added depth to the productions, and everyone laughed at the mental image of a 6-year-old girl swaying dramatically in a sheet pretending to be a tree. The stories kept coming, each one sparking another memory in someone else. And I realized that this was exactly what I had hoped would happen, that by creating space for these stories, they would begin to flow naturally and build on each other. My son-in-law, Michael, who had been quiet most of the evening, suddenly spoke up and said he wanted to share something about my late husband, James, and I felt my heart clench because I still missed James so much that sometimes it felt like a physical ache. Michael said that James had taken him aside before he and Jennifer got married and had given him advice about how to love a strong woman, saying that the key was to give her space to be herself while also being strong enough to stand beside her, and that you had to learn the difference between supporting and controlling. Michael's voice cracked as he said that conversation had shaped his entire marriage, and he wished he could thank James for it, and I had to excuse myself from the table for a moment because the emotion was too much. When I came back, everyone was quiet and respectful of my grief, but also eager to hear more about James, and I found myself telling stories about how we met and how awkward our first date had been, and how he had proposed to me in the most unromantic way possible, just asking me while we were doing dishes one night if I thought we should get married. I said I had been so surprised I dropped a plate and it shattered on the floor, and James had said, "Well, I guess that's a yes." And somehow that ridiculous proposal had led to 46 years of marriage that had been imperfect and beautiful and full of a love that sustained me even now that he was gone. My granddaughter Emma asked me what the secret was to staying married that long, and I thought about it carefully because I wanted to give her an honest answer, not just something that sounded good. I told her that there was no secret, really, that marriage was work every single day, and some days that work felt easy and joyful, and other days it felt impossible and exhausting, and that the key was deciding every morning that you were going to keep choosing that person even when they annoyed you or disappointed you or forgot to take out the trash for you the 100th time. I said that James and I had gone through periods where we barely liked each other, times when we were so focused on raising children and paying bills and surviving that we forgot to actually connect, and we had to make a conscious effort to find our way back to each other. I told her about the year when our marriage almost fell apart, when James was working constantly and I was home with 3 small children, and I felt so lonely and resentful that I seriously considered leaving, and how we had finally had this huge fight where everything came out, all the hurt and anger and disappointment, and how that fight had actually saved us because it forced us to be honest about what wasn't working. Emma listened intently and asked what changed after that fight, and I said we started doing small things differently. Like James made sure to come home for dinner at least 3 nights a week, and I tried to be less critical about the way he did things around the house. And we instituted a rule that we would spend at least 30 minutes together every night after the kids were in bed just talking about our days. I said it sounds simple, but those 30 minutes became sacred time, and even when we were tired or had nothing particular to say, we would sit together on the couch and just be present with each other. And that presence built a foundation that carried us through all the hard years that followed. Robert then spoke up and said he wanted to talk about what it was like growing up as my son. And I felt a flutter of nervousness because I knew I hadn't been a perfect mother and I worried what he might say. He told everyone that I had been fierce and protective and sometimes too controlling, that I had opinions about everything and wasn't afraid to share them even when nobody asked, but that underneath all of that was a love so deep and unwavering that he never once doubted that I would fight for him no matter what. He said there was a time in high school when he got into serious trouble, the kind of trouble that could have derailed his whole life. And instead of judging him or giving up on him, I had stood beside him and helped him work through it, going to meetings with him and advocating for him, and never making him feel like he was beyond redemption. He said he had never told me how much that meant to him because teenage boys don't say things like that, but that my belief in him during that dark time had given him the strength to believe in himself, and everything good in his life had come from that foundation. I felt tears streaming down my face because I had spent years worrying that I had failed him, that I had been too harsh or too demanding or not understanding enough, and hearing him say that I had helped him in the way that mattered most was a gift I hadn't known I needed. Jennifer added that she had a different experience of me as a mother because, as the oldest daughter, she had received both the most attention and the most pressure, and that she had spent years trying to live up to expectations that she thought I had for her, before realizing that most of those expectations were ones she had created in her own head. She said she used to be angry at me for not being more warm and demonstrative, for showing love through action rather than words, but that she had come to understand that I was loving her in the only way I knew how, the way my own mother had loved me. She said having her own children had given her compassion for how hard I had tried and how much I had sacrificed, and that she wanted to tell me while she still could that I had been a good mother even if I wasn't a perfect one, and that she was grateful for everything I had given her, including the things I didn't realize I was giving. Sarah, who was my youngest, chimed in and said that by the time she came along, I had relaxed considerably and was much less controlling, which both Jennifer and Robert immediately disputed, saying I had absolutely not relaxed, and if anything, I had gotten more opinionated with age. This sparked a playful argument about whether I had been stricter with the older kids or the younger one, and I laughed and said I had probably been equally difficult with all of them, just in different ways, and that I had done my best with the knowledge and energy I had at each stage of motherhood. The conversation then shifted to my grandchildren, and I asked each of them to share a memory they had of time spent with me or with their grandfather James, and I was surprised by what they chose to talk about because it wasn't the big events or expensive trips, but rather small, ordinary moments that had somehow lodged themselves in their hearts. Tyler, who was 16, said he remembered coming to our house when he was maybe 7 or 8, and James teaching him how to play chess and how patient his grandfather had been, even when Tyler kept forgetting which way the pieces could move, never getting frustrated or making him feel stupid. He said James had told him that chess was like life, that you had to think several moves ahead, and sometimes you had to sacrifice something small to protect something bigger, and that wisdom had stayed with him even though at the time he had just been excited to move the little horse-shaped pieces around the board. His twin sister Maya said her favorite memory was of baking cookies with me on Saturday mornings, and how I would let her crack the eggs, even though she always got shells in the batter, and how we would eat the raw cookie dough while we waited for the first batch to bake, even though we both knew we weren't supposed to. She said those mornings had made her feel special and seen, like she had my complete attention in a way that was rare in her busy life, and that she still used the recipe we had made together, and every time she baked those cookies, she thought of me. My oldest granddaughter, Emma, talked about the summer she had stayed with James and me for 2 weeks when she was 14 and going through a difficult time with her parents, and how I had let her be angry and sad without trying to fix it, just sitting with her while she cried and telling her stories about my own teenage years and the times I had felt misunderstood and alone. She said I had made her feel like her pain was valid and temporary, that it was something she would survive and learn from, and that those 2 weeks had been a turning point for her in understanding that hard feelings don't last forever. My grandson, Marcus, who was 12, said he remembered James taking him fishing and how they had sat in the boat for hours without catching anything. But it hadn't mattered because James had told him stories the whole time, stories about his own childhood and about serving in the military and about all the jobs he had worked before he found the one that stuck. Marcus said he had felt very grown up on that fishing trip, like James was treating him as an equal and sharing things he might not share with a child, and that sense of being respected and trusted had made him want to be worthy of it. My youngest granddaughter, Sophie, who was 8, had been quiet through most of the evening, but now she spoke up in her small, clear voice and said that her favorite thing about coming to my house was that I always had butterscotch candies in a dish on the coffee table, and I never told her she couldn't have them, and that sometimes simple pleasures were the best kind. Everyone laughed at this honest assessment from a child's perspective, and I made a mental note to always keep that candy dish filled because you never know what small gesture will become a cherished memory. Then I asked my grandchildren what questions they had about the family, what they wondered about or wanted to understand better, and there was a long pause as they thought about it. Finally, Emma asked how I had dealt with losing my parents, because she knew that time was coming for her own parents eventually, and she was terrified of it. I took a deep breath and told her the truth, which was that you never really get over losing your parents. You just learn to carry the loss differently, and that the grief comes in waves sometimes expected and sometimes catching you completely off guard. I said I still sometimes reached for the phone to call my mother before remembering she was gone, and that there were moments when something would happen, and my first thought would be, I need to tell Dad about this, and then the reality would hit me again fresh and painful. I told Emma that what helped was keeping their memory alive by telling stories and passing down their wisdom and trying to live in a way that would make them proud, and that having this family gathered around the table was exactly the kind of thing my mother would have loved. So, in some way, she was here with us through the legacy she had created. My daughter, Jennifer, added that losing James had taught her that grief and love are two sides of the same coin, that we grieve deeply because we loved deeply, and that she would rather have the pain of loss than never have had the love at all. Marcus then asked a question that surprised me. He wanted to know if James and I had ever regretted having children, if there were times when we wished we had chosen a different path, and I appreciated his honesty, even though it was an uncomfortable question. I told him that yes, there were moments when we felt overwhelmed and exhausted and wondered what our lives would have been like if we had remained childless. Moments when the responsibility felt crushing and the sacrifices felt too great, but that those moments were fleeting and far outweighed by the joy and meaning that our children brought to our lives. I said that having children had forced us to become better people than we might have been otherwise, that it had demanded we learn patience and selflessness, and how to love someone more than we loved ourselves, and that those lessons had enriched every aspect of our existence. I told Marcus that the hard parts of parenting, the sleepless nights and the worry and the financial strain, were real and shouldn't be minimized, but that they were also temporary, and what remained was this incredible bond and this sense of having participated in something larger than ourselves. James had once told me that being a parent was like having your heart walking around outside your body, completely vulnerable and exposed. And that was both terrifying and beautiful, and I thought that description captured it perfectly. Sarah then shared a story I had forgotten about. A time when she was in college and had called me in the middle of the night crying because she had failed an important exam and was convinced she was going to flunk out and ruin her life. And I had driven 3 hours to her campus and sat with her in the parking lot until sunrise just listening and reassuring her that one exam did not define her worth or determine her future. She said she had felt so ashamed calling me, like she was burdening me with her problems, but that I had never made her feel that way, had instead made her feel like her struggles mattered and deserved attention. She said that night had taught her that love sometimes means just showing up and being present, and that she had tried to be that kind of parent to her own daughters, the kind who drops everything when they're needed. Robert added that James had done something similar for him when he was going through his divorce, just showing up at his apartment with groceries and helping him pack up his things, and never once saying I told you so, even though James had warned him that the marriage might not work. Robert said James had been his anchor during that time, steady and solid when everything else in his life was falling apart, and that he had learned from James that real strength wasn't about never falling down, it was about helping people get back up. These stories about James were filling me with both sadness and gratitude. Sadness that he wasn't here to hear how much he had meant to everyone, and gratitude that his legacy lived on through the people he had loved and shaped. I found myself wishing desperately that I had started this recording project while he was still alive, that I had captured his voice and his stories and his particular way of seeing the world, and I made a mental note to reach out to his brother, who was still living, and ask him to share memories of James so that at least some of his story would be preserved. My sister Margaret seemed to read my mind and said that she had some old home videos of family gatherings that included James, and that she would digitize them and share them with everyone so we could see him again moving and laughing and being himself. The conversation continued for another hour with people sharing memories and asking questions and telling stories that sparked other stories, and I watched the camera recording it all, capturing these faces and voices and moments that would otherwise be lost to time. At one point, my grandson Tyler asked me what I wanted people to remember about me after I was gone, and the question stopped me cold because I had never really thought about it in such direct terms. I sat there for a moment, considering how to answer, and finally I said that I hoped people would remember that I loved fiercely, even if I didn't always express it perfectly, that I tried my best even when my best wasn't good enough, and that I believed family was the most important thing in life, and everything I did was in service of keeping us connected. I said I hoped my grandchildren would remember that they came from people who worked hard and sacrificed much and who believed that the next generation should have more opportunities than they had, and that this belief had shaped every decision their great grandparents and grandparents had made. I told them that I hoped they would pass down the stories we were recording today, that they would add their own stories to the collection, and that someday their grandchildren would sit around a table and learn about all of us and understand the long chain of love and struggle and triumph that led to them. Emma asked if we could talk about the hardest times the family had been through. Not just the happy memories, but the struggles and challenges that had shaped us. And I felt both proud of her maturity and hesitant about opening old wounds. But I knew she was right, that a complete family history had to include the difficult parts. So I asked Margaret if she would be comfortable talking about our brother who had struggled with addiction and had died too young. Margaret nodded and said she thought it was important to talk about him honestly because pretending he didn't exist or that his struggles weren't real did a disservice to his memory and to anyone in the family who might be facing similar challenges. She told my grandchildren about their great uncle David, who had been funny and charming and deeply troubled, who had fought demons that the family didn't fully understand, and who had died alone in a cheap apartment at the age of 42 from an overdose that might have been accidental or might not have been. She said the family had tried everything to help him, interventions and rehab and tough love and unconditional love, but that sometimes people are sick in ways that love alone cannot cure. And learning to accept that had been one of the hardest lessons of her life. She talked about the guilt she still carried, wondering if there was something more she could have done, some magic combination of words or actions that might have saved him, and how she had finally learned through therapy that you cannot save someone who does not want to be saved, that addiction is a disease that requires the person suffering from it to choose recovery and you cannot choose it for them. Robert said he had vague memories of Uncle David, of a man who would show up at family gatherings and be the life of the party for an hour and then disappear for months. And that, even as a child, he had sensed something was wrong but didn't have the language to name it. Jennifer said she remembered our mother crying a lot during that time, and how the adults would speak in hushed tones and stop talking when children entered the room, and how that secrecy had made everything feel scarier than it probably needed to be. I told them that we had tried to protect the children from the full truth of what was happening, but that in retrospect, maybe we should have been more honest in age-appropriate ways, because secrets have a way of creating shame and confusion. Margaret agreed and said that David's addiction had been treated like a shameful secret rather than an illness, and that the stigma around mental health and substance abuse had prevented him from getting the kind of comprehensive care he needed. She said things were better now in terms of how we talk about these issues, but that we still had a long way to go, and that she hoped if anyone in the family ever struggled with similar challenges, they would feel safe asking for help without fear of judgment. This led to a conversation about mental health more broadly, and Sarah shared that she had dealt with depression after her second daughter was born, a darkness that had descended so suddenly and completely that she had barely recognized herself. She said she had been afraid to tell anyone because she thought it meant she was a bad mother, that she should be grateful for her healthy baby instead of feeling empty and hopeless, and that the shame of those feelings had almost destroyed her. She said it was her sister Jennifer who had finally noticed something was wrong and had sat her down and said, "I think you need help." And that simple, direct statement had given her permission to stop pretending she was okay. Sarah told her daughters, who were hearing this story for the first time, that getting treatment for postpartum depression had saved her life and probably saved her marriage, and that there was no shame in needing medication or therapy or support to get through hard times. Her daughter Emma reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand, tears in her eyes, and said she had no idea Sarah had gone through that. And Sarah said, "That's exactly why we need to talk about these things, because suffering in silence helps no one." The mood in the room had grown heavy with these difficult revelations, but there was also something cleansing about them, a sense that by speaking these truths out loud, we were releasing some of the power they had held over us. I decided to shift the tone slightly by asking people to share lessons they had learned from difficult times, wisdom that had come from struggle, because I wanted my grandchildren to understand that hardship could be transformative if we let it teach us. Jennifer talked about how going through a serious health scare in her 30s had completely changed her priorities, had made her realize that she had been spending all her energy on things that didn't actually matter while neglecting the relationships and experiences that did, and that the fear of dying had paradoxically taught her how to really live. Robert spoke about losing his job during the recession and how devastating that had been to his sense of self-worth, how he had defined himself by his career and his ability to provide for his family. And when that was stripped away, he had to rebuild his identity from scratch. He said it had been terrifying and humbling, but also ultimately liberating, because he had learned that he was more than his job title and his paycheck, and that his value as a person and as a father didn't depend on his professional success. He said the experience had taught him empathy for people going through similar struggles and had made him a better manager when he eventually found work again, because he understood viscerally what it felt like to be vulnerable and uncertain. Sarah talked about her divorce and how it had felt like a failure, even though she knew intellectually that sometimes relationships end, and that doesn't mean anyone failed, and how she had to learn to forgive herself for not being able to make the marriage work, and to forgive her ex-husband for his part in the dissolution. She said the hardest part had been telling her daughters and worrying about how it would affect them, but that they had all survived it and maybe even grown stronger from learning that families can take different shapes and still be full of love. Margaret shared that losing her husband to cancer had been the defining tragedy of her life, watching someone she loved waste away, despite all the treatments and prayers and desperate hopes, and that she had been angry at the universe for a long time after he died. She said the anger had eventually transformed into something else, not acceptance exactly, but a kind of peace with the fact that life is unfair and painful and beautiful all at once, and that we don't get to control how long we have with the people we love. We only get to control how fully we love them while they're here. She looked directly at the camera and said, "If there's one thing I want you all to remember, it's that don't wait to tell people you love them. Don't assume there will be more time. Don't let pride or stubbornness or fear keep you from expressing what's in your heart, because you never know when your last conversation will be your last conversation." The room was silent after Margaret spoke, everyone absorbing the weight of her words. And then my granddaughter Maya asked a question that seemed to come from a place of genuine curiosity rather than morbidity. She asked if I was afraid of dying. I thought about it carefully because I wanted to give an honest answer. And I said that I wasn't afraid of being dead because I figured that would be like going to sleep and not waking up. But I was afraid of the process of dying, of pain and loss of dignity and becoming a burden. I said I was also afraid of leaving before I had said everything I needed to say, and before I had seen certain things happen, like my grandchildren growing up and maybe having children of their own. But I also said that at 70 years old, I had lived a full life. I had loved and been loved. I had raised children who turned into good people. I had experienced joy and sorrow and everything in between. And if I died tomorrow, I would die knowing that my life had meaning and purpose. I told them that this gathering, this recording of our family stories, was part of how I was making peace with my mortality by ensuring that something of me and of all of us would continue beyond our individual lives. Tyler asked what I thought happened after death, if I believed in heaven or any kind of afterlife, and I told him honestly that I didn't know, and that anyone who claimed certainty about such things was either more faithful or more foolish than I was. I said I hoped there was something, some kind of continuation or reunion with the people I had lost, but that I tried not to spend too much energy worrying about it because I couldn't control it, and dwelling on the unknowable took time away from living in the present. I said what I did believe was that we live on through the people we touch and the stories we leave behind, that James was still alive in all of us who remembered him and carried his lessons forward, and that someday I would live on in the same way. Emma said she found that idea comforting, the notion that death wasn't really an ending but a transformation, and I nodded and said that's exactly how I tried to think about it. Then Sophie, my youngest granddaughter, who had been mostly quiet, asked if we could talk about happy things now because all the sad talk was making her feel worried, and everyone laughed and agreed that we should shift to lighter topics. I asked everyone to share their favorite family tradition, something we did together that made them feel connected and happy, and the responses came quickly and enthusiastically. Sophie immediately said Christmas morning when everyone opens stockings together and we go around one person at a time so nobody misses anything, and how she loved watching people's faces when they discovered what was inside. Maya said she loved our summer barbecues when all the cousins would play in the yard until dark and the adults would sit on the porch telling stories, and how those long, lazy evenings felt timeless and perfect. Tyler surprised me by saying his favorite tradition was our birthday phone calls, how I called each family member on their birthday and sang to them, even though I cannot carry a six tune to save my life, and how he secretly looked forward to my terrible off-key singing because it made him feel special and remembered. Marcus said he loved Thanksgiving because it was the one day a year when the whole family gathered and we went around the table saying what we were grateful for. And even though it was sometimes corny, he liked hearing what mattered to people and feeling part of something bigger than himself. Emma talked about the tradition James had started of taking each grandchild out for a one-on-one lunch on their birthday, just them and their grandfather, and how she had felt so grown up and important during those lunches, and how she wished he could have continued doing it, but she was grateful for the memories she had. Jennifer said her favorite tradition was our New Year's Day brunch, when we would all show up in pajamas and eat too much and play board games all afternoon, and how starting the year surrounded by family set a tone of connection and ease. Robert mentioned our annual family photo that we took every Christmas, how we would all crowd together and someone would inevitably blink or make a face, but we kept the photo. Anyway, and how looking back through years of those photos, you could see the family growing and changing, babies being born and people getting older, and how powerful it was to have that visual record of our journey together. Sarah said she loved our spring cleaning days when we would all descend on my house and help me with yard work and deep cleaning, and how we would order pizza afterward and sit in the backyard admiring our collective work, and how those days taught her children the value of helping family and working together toward a common goal. Margaret said her favorite tradition was quieter and more personal. The Sunday afternoon phone calls we had maintained for decades, just checking in and sharing the small details of our lives, and how those regular connections had kept us close even when life got busy and complicated. I felt my heart swell listening to all of these traditions that I had helped create or maintain, realizing that what had seemed like simple gestures or repeated events had actually woven a fabric of connection that held us together. I told them that traditions were important because they gave us touchstones, reliable moments in an unpredictable world where we knew we belonged and were loved, and that I hoped they would continue these traditions and maybe create new ones as the family evolved. Then I asked what values they thought defined our family, what principles or beliefs had been passed down through generations, and this question sparked a thoughtful discussion. Robert said he thought resilience was a core family value, that we had been through so much hardship over the generations, but we always found a way to survive and rebuild. And that strength in the face of adversity was something he saw in every family member. Jennifer said she thought loyalty was central, that we might fight with each other and disagree and get on each other's nerves, but we always showed up for family when it mattered. And that unconditional commitment to each other was what held us together through everything. Sarah identified humor as a key value, how we used laughter to diffuse tension and to cope with hard times, and how the ability to find something funny even in dark moments had saved us more times than we probably realized. Emma said she thought curiosity was important, that our family encouraged questions and learning and trying new things, and that there was a spirit of growth and evolution rather than staying stuck in old patterns. Margaret said she believed service was a core value, that we had always been taught to help others and to use whatever privileges or resources we had to make life better for people who were struggling, and that sense of responsibility to the broader community was something that had been instilled in each generation. I listened to them identify these values and felt proud that they had absorbed these lessons even when I thought they weren't paying attention. And I added that I thought authenticity was also a family value, that we encouraged people to be themselves rather than conforming to external expectations, and that this had sometimes made us odd or difficult, but it had also allowed each person to develop their unique gifts and perspectives. As the evening wore on and people started to get tired, I could see that we had created something meaningful, that this wasn't just a pleasant family gathering, but a deliberate act of preservation and connection. I asked if there was anything else anyone wanted to say for the recording, any final thoughts or messages they wanted to leave for future generations, and there was a thoughtful silence as people considered. Finally, my son in law Michael spoke up and said he wanted to thank me for welcoming him into the family and never making him feel like an outsider. And he wanted future in laws to know that this family had room for everyone and that blood wasn't the only thing that made you family. Robert's wife added that she appreciated how the family had supported her through her own struggles with infertility and the difficult path to adoption, and how nobody had ever made her feel less than because she couldn't have biological children. And she wanted adopted family members in future generations to know they were just as much a part of this story as anyone else. These testimonials from people who had married into the family touched me deeply because I realized that we had managed to create something expansive and inclusive rather than closed and tribal, and that was an achievement worth celebrating. Then Emma said she wanted to speak directly to future generations who would watch this recording, and she looked right at the camera with tears in her eyes and said, "I hope you know how lucky you are to come from these people, to have this legacy of strength and love and resilience, and I hope you feel the weight of responsibility that comes with that. Inheritance, not as a burden, but as a gift." She said, "I hope you add your own stories to this collection and that you remember that you're part of something much bigger than yourself, and that the choices you make and the life you live will become part of the story that gets passed down to your children and grandchildren." Her words hung in the air, and I saw several people wiping tears, and I knew that this was exactly why I had wanted to do this, to create not just a record, but a sense of continuity and purpose that would outlive all of us. I turned off the camera finally and thanked everyone for participating and for being so open and honest. And I told them that I would make copies of the recording for each family so they could watch it and share it and add to it over the years. People started gathering their things and saying goodbye, hugging each other a little longer and a little tighter than usual. And I could feel that something had shifted in the room, that we had touched something profound together. After everyone left except Sarah, who stayed to help me clean up, we worked in comfortable silence for a while, and then she said, "Mom, thank you for doing this. Thank you for caring enough about our history to preserve it." I told her it was my privilege and my responsibility, that I was the keeper of these stories right now, and it was my job to pass them on before I lost the chance. She hugged me and said, "You're more than a keeper of stories. You're the heart of this family." And I felt tears spring to my eyes because being seen and valued by your children is one of life's greatest gifts. That night, after everyone was gone and the house was quiet again, I sat alone in my living room and watch some of the footage I had recorded, and seeing my family on that screen, telling their stories and sharing their hearts made me weep with gratitude and grief all mixed together. I thought about how quickly time passes, how my children who had once been babies were now middle aged with children of their own, how my sister and I, who had once been young, women were now elderly, how the family kept growing and changing even as we tried to hold on to what was precious. I thought about James and how much I wished he could have been part of this recording, and I promised him silently that I would keep our stories alive, that I would make sure our grandchildren and their children knew who he was and what he stood for. I thought about my parents and grandparents and all the people who had come before me, whose stories I had not recorded and whose voices were now lost forever, and I felt the ache of that loss, but also a determination that the chain would not break with my generation. I stayed up late into the night making notes about other stories I wanted to record, other questions I wanted to ask, other family members I needed to reach out to before time ran out. Over the following months, I continued the project, reaching out to extended family members and recording their stories, asking them to share memories and wisdom and lessons you learned. I recorded my elderly cousin who had immigrated as a child and who remembered the journey and the fear and the hope that had accompanied it. I recorded James's brother who told me stories about their childhood that I had never heard, about their father's temper and their mother's quiet strength, and the day James decided he was going to marry me even though I didn't know it yet. I recorded my children's godparents and longtime family friends who had been present for so many important moments and who had their own perspectives on our family's journey. Each recording felt like a gift, another thread woven into the tapestry of our collective memory, and I became almost obsessive about the project, driven by the awareness that time was running out for so many of these voices. My children teased me gently about my new hobby, but they also supported it. And Jennifer helped me organize all the footage and create a simple system for cataloging and storing it. Sarah worked with me to edit some of the longer recordings into shorter highlight reels that would be easier for people to watch. And Robert built a simple website where family members could access the videos and add their own stories and photos. What had started as a single Christmas gathering had evolved into something much larger, a living archive that the whole family contributed to and drew strength from. I received messages from family members saying they had watched the recordings with their children and had found themselves crying and laughing and feeling connected to their roots in ways they hadn't in years. My grandson Marcus told me he had shown some of the footage to his friends at school for a project about family history, and his friends had said they wished their families had something like this. My granddaughter Emma said she had watched the recording from Christmas night at least a dozen times, and each time she discovered something new, some detail or expression or story that she hadn't fully absorbed before. I realized that we had created not just a historical document, but a tool for connection, something that brought the family together even when we were physically apart. As I sit here now, a year later, preparing for another Christmas gathering, I think about how much richer our family story has become through this intentional act of remembering and recording. We have hours of footage now, dozens of voices preserved, hundreds of stories told, and the project continues to grow as younger family members start contributing their own memories and perspectives. My great niece, who is studying film in college, has offered to help make the recordings more professional, adding music and graphics and creating themed compilations around topics like immigration, resilience, love, and loss. My grandson, Tyler, who once asked if he had to talk on camera, now regularly sends me voice memos sharing his thoughts and experience, and I add them to the archive because even young stories matter. Even present moments will someday be history. I have started writing accompanying notes for each recording, providing context and explaining relationships and filling in details that might not be clear from the videos alone. And this written record has become its own project, a memoir of sorts that I am leaving for future generations. I write about the small moments that don't make it into recordings, the ordinary days that somehow contain extraordinary love, the quiet sacrifices and daily choices that shape family's character. I write about my regrets and my hopes, about what I got right and what I wish I had done differently, about the lessons I learned too late and the wisdom I want to pass on before it's lost. Sometimes I worry that I am being too maudlin or too focused on the past, that I should be living in the present rather than constantly documenting and preserving. But then I remember my father's funeral and that hollow feeling of questions unasked and stories untold, and I know that this work matters. I know that someday, maybe decades from now, someone I will never meet will watch these recordings and will feel connected to their history, will understand that they come from people who loved deeply and struggled bravely and who wanted more than anything for their descendants to thrive. I know that this archive is my legacy, more important than any money I might leave behind or possessions I might pass down, because stories are what connect us across time and space and death itself. This Christmas, when my family gathers, I will set up the camera again and we will add to our collection. And I imagine this will become its own tradition, an annual ritual of remembrance and connection. I hope that long after I am gone, my grandchildren will continue this practice, that they will gather their own children and grandchildren and tell stories and record them, adding new chapters to a story that began long before any of us, and that will continue long after we are all dust. I hope they will watch the footage of me and James and my sister and my children, and they will see real people who lived and loved and made mistakes and tried their best. Not perfect people, but authentic ones, and that this authenticity will give them permission to be fully themselves. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can find a little warmth and hope in these stories too.